Hello everyone, this is Nerd Mela. I am Brahmavadini and I have with me Sara and Shekhar.
Hi.
Hello.
In this video, we will be continuing our conversation on protests, the history of protests. If you have not seen the part 1 of this video, you can click on the link right now on the screen. And so let's continue with our conversation. In the previous episode, we also saw how protests prevent violent revolutionary activities. And through the examples of young Italy and the nihilism movement in Russia, we saw how when the protests become weak and the democracy is not strong enough to accept them, the protests often turn violent, which is not good for the people and the cause. And we can juxtapose this with the benefits of peaceful public protests that we have seen in our own history. The first thing that comes to mind would be the RTI Act.
The Right to Information Act of
Yeah.
2004.
It was a massive people's movement which started in the 1990s and then culminated in 2004.
And the anti-price rise movement of the student movement in 1970s, the anti-emergency movement. So that led to the, as mentioned before, the political diversification.
There was a new crop of leaders.
Yes.
And in India, we also have the women's right movement as well
That culminated into the Hindu Succession Act of 2005 and the Domestic Violence Prohibition Act of 2004.
And then recent example would be the Jan Lokpal bill.
Yeah,
How like a people's movement led to Jan Lokpal bill.
Yeah, and it also, just to add to it, it also gave the rise for a new political face to that anti-corruption
Arvind
movement through
Kejriwal.
the form of Arvind Kejriwal and other leaders, and ultimately formed the Aam Aadmi Party.
And also changed the national politics in a big way.
That affected in a way that affected the 2014 elections, like what it was fought for.
Internationally also, recently the Arab Spring led to toppling of several dictatorial regimes.
And of course, like we mentioned about the US civil rights movement as well, when we talk about the benefits, it played a great role in emancipation of African Americans and women in US.
And if we look closely, there has been an increasing trend, an upsurge in people's movement across the world. Of course, the first example would be the thing that we started with, the CAA and the NRC protests that are taking place in our country. People have come out in large numbers across the country, even bigger towns, smaller towns, everybody is participating.
Yes, and though we are yet to see, no one can actually predict what it can lead up to, but right now what it has brought out as you mentioned, it has brought out a very, varied classes of people together to protest against the law. And then recently, even in the US, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement against the inequality, the wealth inequalities. And we also had around 2017, we had the Women's March as soon as, US President Donald Trump took oath. And also the same year saw the Me Too movement as well.
Peaking and spreading in other countries also.
Yes, that
And then
was
it
very
came to India as well.
Yes. And among other countries as well, among the recent protests we witnessed in Hong Kong, in Australia, in France, Canada, Lebanon, Chile, and Sudan. And all of them were, the causes for these protests were varied, but all again, like the common thread was that people's voices, they had come out on the streets for their interests.
If we see, there are some common features in all. There is a common thread in all these protests.
Politically, there is a backlash to autocracy and centralization. Be it in India, the excessive centralization by the recent regime, or in other places where conservative governments have started to accumulate a lot of power. And also there is a swing towards fundamentalism, which is extending from the rise of conservatism.
Like we saw in US as well.
Yes. Politically, there is also this rise of demagoguery in politics, where the leaders are held above others, and they are, and anything who protests against them or speaks against them becomes the other people. It becomes an us versus them issue. And then there is wariness with regard to corruption and lack of transparency. As we saw that this was the reason for protest in 2011 in India.
Then there are economic reasons as well, like there is inequality, there is instability of the economic conditions, and
with the trade wars, etc. And inequalities also is as a result of this globalized economy, which has benefited only a section of society and not.
Now there is
everybody.
this feeling that
Yeah, and a certain example of that could be the farmer protests that happened in India before the 2019 Lok Sabha elections. They were quite widespread.
Then also the poor economic conditions.
Globally, this trade wars and all these changing economics has led to fall in commodity prices, and that is hitting a lot of people, and that is why people are coming out for economic reasons.
And then there are also several social factors as well.
There is a rise of majoritarianism in society, so which is again rubbing the minorities in a wrong way, be it the Hindutva causing trouble for the Dalits or the white majority in US,
bringing back the horrors of racial discrimination in the country
and targeting the minorities there,
especially those the immigrant minorities such as the Muslims,
especially the Muslims.
And socially, there is also this beginning of division between the youth, student-led movements and the elderly, conservative people. There is this social divide that is emerging because now in most of the countries, it is the youth who students especially who are at the forefront of the protests, and whereas the establishment is being backed by those conservative people. So that's again a division. There are certain international reasons. There is a multipolar change in the international politics which has led to decrease in the dominance by earlier power centers such as US and Europe, and there is rise of other countries such as India and China. So that is raising a national consciousness among those people, and that is raising the anti-globalization perception. And this anti-globalization perception is also leading to xenophobia among people. In every country, there is an anti-migration feeling that is generating a lot of public discord. Also, the digitization, the greater digitization and this pervasiveness of mobile phones has allowed for greater coordination among people to connect. We've seen in the CAA protest, Twitter has been a great coordinating point for people for protesters in different cities. And also the climate protests.
Even though Greta Thunberg is at the forefront, but she is only in one country. The rest of the countries they followed suit, and then there were protests.
That was a result of digitization across the world.
And then the international terrorism has also contributed to people's agitation. This, especially this anti-migration protest, has to do with the terrorism and threats that have emerged internationally. And also in social science, there is something called the rise of postmodernism, which is a greater self-assertion. So now there is a dismantling of meta-narratives, and people have gained this greater self-respect, and that is why they are trying to emerge as a distinct community based on own principles. The Hindutva philosophy is kind of benefiting from this post-modernism because people want to identify themselves as Indians. So when people are looking for their past, they are presented with these radical or jingoistic interpretation of Hinduism in the form of Hindutva, which is fueling these misguided notions of extreme nationalism.
And we've also seen that there are some new trends that are emerging in these protests and the movements that we have seen across the world.
As we've seen that mainly the younger population of the student generation is protesting against the current government regimes all over the world. One reason for this could be that the common people have not really experienced the misery of the war or the consequences of a jingoistic nationalism, whereas the students or the awakened or the more informed community of people, they have known this through studies or through education, through research, etc. That is why they can gauge it better.
And they are trying to prevent such a thing from happening again.
Yeah.
Another trend which is quite interesting is that the people who are now sort of trying to curb it are the same people who've benefited from these protests in the past. Like in India only, we can take the example that the BJP, it benefited from the anti-corruption movement in 2011-12.
Even prior to that, in the people's movement in the post-independence era had seen greater participation from the current ruling dispensation.
And another trend would that be of fake news in this age of social media.
Yeah, the challenges of manufactured news and this narratives is huge, because every now and then you'll find a story on, especially on Twitter, that this is something that is not being taught in the textbooks, and then they'll give some conspiracy theory of everything that we have studied.
And this is not just the case in India, even in United States, Trump supporters have this, they've used fake news to spread a sense of fear and to create an atmosphere of othering.
A very interesting case is that of the corporates against the solar power development. A few years back, there was a campaign running in US where corporates were telling the people and mobilizing people against the solar power industry by asking them to campaign against the locking of sunlight. I mean, as ridiculous as this sounds, but that was the case.
And like I mentioned, the whole us versus them, this othering of people.
Yeah, whoever is not supporting the regime, they are labeled as enemies of the state. And the angst of the, especially the middle class, is or the lower middle class is channelized by saying that an outsider should have the leadership now.
And another trend that we are seeing is that there is a sense of camaraderie between the leaders who are seen as autocratic. You know, you look at a lot of international events, you've seen the faces of Modi, Benjamin Netanyahu, Donald Trump, Erdogan. They come together and have a sense of, they present a sense of belonging. Individually as well, they kind of present, and they make it a point that they present a spectacle wherever they represent their countries. So that is something that has been seen common amongst when you talk about new trends.
Earlier, the spectacle was created by honoring those people who were standing for people's movement.
Yeah.
For instance, a Greta Thunberg is less likely to get a support from these leaders.
Yeah, say like Donald Trump.
Or even Modi.
Yes.
But would rather get support from Barack Obama.
Yeah, who has actually even appreciated her efforts.
So these autocratic leaders do not side with the public interest, and they don't even convey the liberalism or tolerance.
They feel comfortable ignoring the protesters and labeling them as miscreants. And if you look at it, Donald Trump is a pro-life, pro-Christian leader, and on the other hand, Mr. Modi is espousing Hindutva philosophy. And if you look at both these ideologies, they are not very open to other religion or other.
They do not speak tolerance. Radical ideologies never speak tolerance, but somehow they are in sync when they come to international platforms and show.
They are like, we
camaraderie.
radicals are standing together because we have the same, which is not actually accurate. They call themselves as the
voice of those disenfranchised and those ignored in
for
the
a very,
last
very long time.
decade or so. But when interest of the people, such as questions of climate change, is raised by somebody, say Greta Thunberg,
then
shut out.
Yeah.
And then there is this trend that we are seeing that extremist groups are kind of getting a say in the mainstream as well. Be it in the case of, again, we're using the examples of US and India. In US, you have white supremacists who have come out in the open now in the age of Donald Trump. And in India as well, we've seen a lot of Hindutva
warriors.
Yeah, warriors who were earlier referred to as fringe groups. They have
now though they have transcended to the mainstream now. MLAs like
And the MOS only abhi recently
Yes,
said
we
the
had.
Goli Maro comment and
Yes,
everything.
these statements you would earlier associate with fringe elements, but today
they
you
come
have
in the
ministers and MLAs and MPs
They're
saying
both
these.
worshipping as well.
Yes, that is something that has come out in the open. So extremists have found a place in the mainstream.
now when the government is openly dismissing the people and they are openly following an agenda that is against the people, and only few people are able to understand that properly perhaps, or maybe some people are choosing to ignore this because they have suffered under the previous order and have had grievances against them, because even in an order which perhaps the educated class may appreciate more because that had a stronger institutional base. Most of the people were not happy then also because they did not feel heard. They did not feel that they were represented. So they are trying to give this a chance. Yet those far-sighted can understand that this may not be very good in the long run. That is why these public protests are
taking place. So what is the solution? What is the way forward from this?
when we study history, we see that this is exactly how any big change starts to occur. First,
When
there are
people
few-
start participating.
Yeah, there are few intellectuals that start the fire, then they mobilize people,
Yeah.
and then
As we've mentioned in the part 1 as well, for effective change to happen right now, and so that our future can be better than this, the first
and all of us can be comfortable with the change.
yes, okay, so the first thing that has to be done would be to strengthen the civil society.
Yes. And another thing to do would be to strengthen the dialogue. Like, we cannot leave any uncomfortable conversation, and we have to engage with people on the other side. Like, we may not agree with someone on something, but we have to be capable enough of making them understand our point.
At
And-
least let us make our point. We should not leave the conversation
Yes.
with.
Yes, and that would help create a greater consensus. And even as former IAS officer Kannan Gopinathan had said that
There should be no self-censorship, and another solution could be that people are encouraged to be more politically involved,
yeah,
so that like there is no polarization, that extreme polarization.
yeah, people should be made aware. Like, especially they should be made aware of their rights as voters. Like, with respect to those that they are electing, they should look at them as their representatives and not as rulers.
Also, every challenge is like an opportunity. So while in this current scenario, media has become very polarized.
Yeah.
We see that online we are seeing a lot of content that is not as polarized, gives more rational point of view, provides unbiased news.
Yeah.
It does
And
fact
it-
checks also, like
yes.
alt news.
Yeah,
Yes.
and is ready for arguments supported by
facts and figures.
yeah.
Hmm.
And like we've mentioned in our earlier videos, institutions are very important. So if people are rejecting certain institutions, maybe there is a need for change.
Yeah.
And now, especially when there is greater awareness, maybe we can slowly move from indirect democracy to direct democracy, so that
Yeah.
we can participate more directly in the questions.
Yeah.
By direct democracy here, I mean like the Nordic countries, where there are things like referendum and
Yeah.
initiatives and right to recall, etc., which had come up during the 2011 Jan Lokpal protest
Yeah.
movement also.
Hmm.
So maybe we can move towards that, but in any case, the institutions have to be strong.
And there should be a greater focus on better local governance and human rights issues as well.
That should be the center of any change that is to come in
Yeah.
the future.
And for all of this to happen, citizens have some responsibilities. The first would be to understand what we are standing for, and the second would be to critique our leaders. Even if we have elected them, that is fine. After that also, they are still accountable to us. So we
Yes.
should raise questions. We should ensure that proper work is done in the
Yeah.
government. And thirdly, and most importantly, especially in this climate, that we should treat our opponents as humans foremost.
And this would help in building a greater consensus as well.
With this, we end our conversation for today. I am Brahmavadini.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Shekhar.
Thanks for watching. Please remember to like, share and subscribe. You can also follow us on Twitter at NerdMela and also on Instagram. The links are in the description and stay tuned for more. Bye.
Bye.
So what is the solution? What is the way forward from this? What?